All right, guys, welcome back to the podcast. Special guest today brings a truly rare perspective. Rod Phillips is the former Minister of Finance for Ontario, a role he held during one of the most turbulent economic periods, I'd say, in recent history. Also served as Minister of the Environment, Long-Term Care. He's at CG. He's at our firm. We are lucky enough to have him as senior analyst and vice chairman. I'm correct in that?
That's right. Great to be here, guys. Really been looking forward to this.
Yeah, it's awesome because you're going to bring your political, financial expertise, all of this. So I guess the first question I want to ask you is big picture. Were you surprised at the most recent election results?
No, although I've got to say, anybody who said they knew the outcome of this one probably was lying before it happened. I mean, this is a very unique situation. We haven't really had what amounts to a two-party race in our federal elections, maybe going all the way back to the 1988 election, which was about the original free trade election. But really, because this was about how are we going to be dealing with this major challenge, a number of major challenges, I would say, the major challenge of the relationship with the US and the major challenges facing the country, voters really split into two camps. And that's why we got this very interesting outcome. But I think the fact that Mark Carney, with his experience and his background, was sort of purpose built for this, led us to this outcome, which doesn't mean there weren't some very interesting things that we can talk about, anomalies in those decisions.
Yeah, maybe let's start there. You're right. The two-party race is something that, Canada's not seen in forever. We've had the right split, with various parties. We've had the left split for a very long time with the NDP. So this was definitely something that, the voter turnout won. And then obviously the dichotomy of the votes, like either liberal or conservative, there was kind of nothing else, right? Everyone else got wiped out.
Yeah, for the political watchers, this was the story of the NDP and the Bloc, and their irrelevance, right? More than anything. So if you were sitting now with Pierre Poilievre and he was your guest, you could legitimately see how he could be disappointed because he literally got more votes than any conservative and more percent of vote than any conservative in a very long time, in generations, and yet he didn't win. Right. Mark Carney, on the other hand, blew the doors out in terms of places like Quebec and the vote that the Liberal Party got there. But I think those come down to, in the most part, the calculation that people were making, which was that this is an election that's too important not to pick a team on, if you will, and that for obviously the majority of people, not a majority of people, because the majority of people didn't vote for the governing party. That's the nature of our system, because we have the vote divided up. But enough to give a near majority to Mark Carney, saw that he was, and what he was talking about was the right approach for this next period of time. So we saw the Liberals do very well in Quebec, in large part because the Bloc Québécois did not. In Quebec, the analysis is that normally people would vote for the Bloc to protect Quebec against Canada, but they were more interested in protecting Quebec against Donald Trump.
Yeah.
And so I voted for that. And in other places, and this has been a bit of a trend, may have some other issues behind it, the NDP in places like Ontario and British Columbia, and even on the East Coast, really disappeared as a factor. So those then, in some cases, and very interesting ones, and in a lot of cases, those votes went to the Liberals. But in really interesting places like Windsor, Cambridge, Oshawa, where you could argue those are auto centers, and people would have said, well, gee, Mark Carney's the guy we're going to send to save us, right? They voted for Pierre Poilievre. So interesting splits, and a lot of analysis will be done for a long time to understand this last election.
Yeah, no, I agree. It was a really, really interesting election for the reasons you mentioned, being a two-party race and stuff. But if you asked anybody like last November which party they thought we were going to win, I don't think anybody would have said the Liberals, right? And then things kind of completely switched after the leadership change. How different do you think Mark Carney is going to be than Justin Trudeau would have been?
Well, he is. I think on the surface, I've met both men, a very different person. Like just fundamentally, Mark Carney's thought more about the economy, before he has breakfast than I think Justin Trudeau, who had other focuses, but just that wasn't his focus. Probably thinks about in a week. And I think people
That's a pretty good comment.
and he's he's been very deliberate about his leadership style as well, and would appear to be taking a very strong this is what we're going to do and this is how we're going to do it. So I think his experience is different and his leadership style will be different. Now he has a lot of the same members of his caucus. We'll see. As we're recording this, he hasn't appointed his cabinet yet, but that might happen in even the days ahead. So that'll be interesting to see who he chooses for the various leadership positions. But for example, he has said as just one thing, what I think is different. We will have interprovincial trade barriers, which some economists say cost the Canadian economy 2 to 3% of GDP, solved by Canada Day. Now, he didn't say what Canada Day, but I took it when he said that to mean this coming Canada Day. That's a pretty specific, deliverable, intractable issue that you could say goes back 100 years or more. So I guess we'll judge him on that. Yesterday, he had his meeting with the president, with Donald Trump.
What's your take on that?
Well, back to your question about how is he different from Trudeau? I mean, they literally talked about Trudeau, and Trump talked about Trudeau. So the one thing we know is that Donald Trump thinks very differently about the current prime minister than he did about the last one, probably in a good way, from the point of view of being able to make some decisions and do business together. There was a lot of other things in that meeting that were perhaps disconcerting. I mean, the president reasserted he doesn't want to buy Canadian cars. He doesn't want to buy Canadian steel. He doesn't want to buy Canadian aluminum. He wants all that made in America, but at least we're sitting in the room having a conversation.
Yeah. I'm sitting here, I'm watching that, Rod, I got to tell you, and to be very clear here with all our viewers, we are apolitical here. I don't really care. I've chosen to not give a crap because I have clients on both sides. So I am not taking any sides whatsoever. And I choose not to. I found that so fun and interesting to watch just as pure entertainment. And I was thinking like, what would I do if I was prime minister? How would I approach this? Because on the one hand, you want to stand up for Canada. You want to say, screw you, we're not for sale, blah, blah, blah. But on the other hand, like you want to not be hated and you want to just kind of appease, the emotion and the energy in the room. So like, do you think he handled that piece well?
Listen, I think there's many ways to look at Donald Trump, and none of them explain him all. But one way to look at him is he was a very successful reality TV host. And the events in that, particularly in that office when he does that format, feel a lot like a reality show. Like this is episode 327 of the West Wing with Donald Trump. And so I think you've got to think about it from a performative point of view. There's and even the people in the room, they're all playing a part. I do think that based on where we were coming from, I think the prime minister did well in that first meeting. Similarly, if I were even giving people advice for that meeting, giving him advice, I think there were some things he needed to say, and he needed to make sure he said Canada wasn't for sale. I thought he said that very well. He needed to, from his point of view, correct the facts on some facts about what the president has said about, we don't need anything Canada has to sell. And he said, like, we're your biggest customer, right? So I think he had a few things that he needed to get in there, and he got them in there without getting in between the president and maybe the media and looking like there was some kind of an argument between them, because an argument was not going to serve anybody. So yeah, I think he stood up well in that first test, but that must have been a nervous day for everybody.
Yeah.
Except maybe Donald Trump, who I think it's just Tuesday.
Oh, it's just another day in the office. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, you do get like a different vibe when you watch those meetings than you did with when Trump would meet with Trudeau. How much of Trump's positioning, and like I haven't heard him call Carney governor or anything yet, like how much is it just sort of rhetoric and his own style, and how much of it do you think is serious? Like how bad could the trade war get?
Well, I think his worldview has been formed for a long time about the importance of tariffs, and you can go back to, full page ads he took out in the 80s about Japan at the time, and so he has a belief about the value of things like manufacturing and production of goods, and I think that's really a big part of his worldview. And I don't imagine we're going to change his mind about something he's believed. He's a 79-year-old man. It'd be unusual to change his mind. He's also the kind of person, if you think about people in the development business and you think about his background, who they've got no concern about asking for not just what they want, but twice what they want. because for those people who work in that kind of business, like development, each project, each event has to be successful in its own right. Right. And so the importance of it, if I have to ask for, if I'm building a building, I ask for 100 stories and you've offered me 40, I'm going to get 60. That's a win. Right. So I also think in style. But I also believe, and I don't, people underestimate this, the reality that the U.S. is dealing, at least in the medium term, with a very challenging financial situation. $37 trillion of debt that needs to be, large chunks of which needs to be refinanced over the course of what will be the president's term. So I do think that they are trying to find their way through dealing with a pretty foundational issue. Around just the sustainability, despite all the advantages America has, being the reserve currency, being, this island of innovation in the world, all the great things going on for America. The status quo, from at least their perspective and a lot of smart people's perspective, isn't sustainable. So that's underneath it all. The rest of it is just the kind of guy he is. He's going to ask for the moon, and he believes in tariffs and their power. He doesn't really care about guys who live in Windsor. He cares about guys who live in Flint, Michigan.
How long do you see this playing out, and how does it end?
I don't think it ends while he's president at a certain level. Obviously, renegotiating, and they talked about it yesterday, a new CUSMA, USMCA, new trade agreement might take it off the front burner. But I think the nature of the personality there is that the potential for these things to come up is going to be ongoing. And so an element of that uncertainty is going to exist at least until the midterms. At the midterm elections, which are a year and a bit away, if the Republicans were to lose their majority in Congress, then that might change the dynamic. But I think this is the nature of the guy.
Interesting.
So, I mean, Trump believes in tariffs, and he's been talking about it since the 80s and stuff. But, theoretically, he's only going to be president for 4 years. But, do you think that the rest of the Republican Party is coming around to Trump's perspective, or do you think this is, something that's just being driven by him and his sort of MAGA portion of the Republican Party?
Yeah, that's the right question. I think the party has fundamentally shifted. Now, I think I'm going to put a proviso on it. To the extent that it has electoral success, it will continue to feel that way, and that's why the midterms could be very important. But there's a podcast I sometimes recommend to people. You can put it in your notes if you like, American Compass. It's an interesting podcast, and it's essentially I'll call it the intellectual underpinnings. If you think about Donald Trump's intuitions about things, tariffs good, right? Well, this is a group of people who've done a whole lot of work around why that is the case, right? So there's a whole intellectual underpinning. These particular people, the guys at American Compass, are very close to J.D. Vance, who obviously, as the vice president, could be the next candidate in 2028. So depending on the electoral outcome in the midterms and their fortunes, if they go relatively well, then I think you could expect that this is the kind of direction for the new Republican Party. Will be, more protectionist, more American, more America-centric, and on the other hand, if it seems as though that's not working, political parties do have a way of righting themselves because they like to win, right? But he definitely has put himself in a much stronger position, and we can see that in his ability to get the Congress and the Senate to essentially do what he wants right now because they're Republican controlled.
What about consequences of this escalating trade war that are maybe underappreciated? So I'm going to ask you to put your finance hat on for a second. Think of Canadian consequences that maybe we're not seeing right now. We as citizens of Canada, not as economists.
Listen, to at the highest level, the general disruption to the economy and the general uncertainty across financial markets, both stock markets and the debt market, and the hesitation that we are certainly experiencing, all of us, as we talk to business people around moving ahead with certain things. I mean, that's going to have an impact, and a lot of people think that's going to lead to a recession one way or another. Moving from that level to the next level, the disagreement between China and the United States, and in some ways, China and the group of companies that at least notionally would be aligned to the United States. I mean, that's probably the next most fundamental issue before we even get to the impacts on Canada. There's this interesting app you can watch now where they tracks all the big container ships going across or not going across and like turning around and going to other ports. The disruption in the short and medium term, that people are thinking that's going to start to become evident come the end of May, June, and the inflationary impacts of that, and the unexpected impacts, second and third order impacts of just that disagreement between the two biggest economies in the world, is going to have reverberations, right? And then you take it down to the Canadian level. Clearly, there has been some mitigation of some of the tariffs, but even if we take the auto sector as a place that's talked about, we can go through a few of them. But in that space, short term, there's been much better answers. But we heard the president yesterday, he wants all the cars in America to be made in America, right? That's his plan, right? So he might be figuring out a different way to get there, but even the short-term solutions would have longer-term implications. He talked yesterday about 100% tariff on movies, right? That's a multi-billion-dollar industry of movie production across Canada, right?
That would be tough to implement. I don't know how you do that, but
I mean, he's tending into a world where I would argue he shouldn't, because he's starting to talk about things that could be as much services, where in fact America has a huge surplus with the world in terms of the service industry as opposed to the goods producing industries, and movies could be in that space. But particularly for places like Toronto, Vancouver, where there's big movie industries, there's a lot of people anxious.
Winnipeg, Manitoba.
Winnipeg, exactly. Yeah. And then you get into I'll call it the ag space, potash, the resource components. I mean, each of these could have different outputs. Like the idea that the kinds of essential inputs that America needs are going to be needed more in a world where China isn't an option and where other parts of the world are an option makes sense, right? But I think working all that out is going to be part of the job for Carney, and not to drag the answer too long. I think that's why, the fact is we send our oil to the US at a discount because we haven't built refining capacity, and that refining capacity is there. There's been a long discussion about why we even do that, but the real reason we do that is it's convenient, and it's costs a lot of money to build the refining capacity. But we probably, as a country, and I think now definitely, will be seriously looking at what we need to do to take that crude, not ship it down to the Gulf, but produce, refine that in such a way that we can sell it to world markets, and not be a prisoner of that of the U.S. So I think there's all the layers of it, but I would say, going back to my first point, the biggest layer right now is just the general uncertainty and the number of projects or even just business decisions that people are holding back, and particularly if you think about it in a corporate setting, the risk for people now who are just about to tick a box to start the building of something or start a new product line is that 6 months from now that's going to look really stupid. Not because they could have known that today, but because 6 months from now they'll go like, "Oh, I can't believe that you thought it was a good idea to start that battery plant over there. Didn't you know better?" And so I think there's a natural hesitancy that's going to affect investment, and may lead us to, in at least the short term, a recession.
Yeah. Okay. Adam, I know you had some energy questions, but before getting into further energy questions, I just want to ask you, the individuals out there that are saying, you've heard people say, the end of the world is coming. This is it. You need to go to cash. You need to go to gold. You need to go to real assets. Don't even invest in anything. No bonds, no stock market, no nothing. End of the world. Stop this. What would you say to them?
That's never been the case before. Right. So, they say a stopped clock is right twice a day. Well, someday that might be right, but that's never been the right answer before, which doesn't mean that people shouldn't look at appropriate hedging strategies and consideration of a blend of assets, which I know you guys would recommend. I'll mention another podcast for people who want to delve deeper into it. The name Steve Bannon will be quite familiar to people. Steve Bannon was a senior advisor to the president and a major MAGA cheerleader, if you will. Well, his podcast is called The War Room, right? And if you ever just, if people want to listen to it, what you'll notice is that in between his podcast, he's pitching gold, right? So here's this guy basically saying, you know what? The Western world is coming to an end. The economy's falling apart. There could be a war here, could be there. And then on the breaks, it's like, and by the way, buy gold, right? So there's always people with an interest in these things, but I mean, gold. One of our own analysts had a fascinating piece that's available through the Canaccord network the other day, just demonstrating over time. There's a lot of factors. It isn't a shock that gold is up over 3,000. I didn't look at it today, right? But if you think about the global, the geopolitical tensions, you think about the debt level, right? If essentially the precursor to the U.S. dollar as the reserve currency was gold still holds a place in that universe, and so there are reasons why people are looking at that, right? But really, to answer your question, isn't the end of the world, and I would even say betting against America has tended to be a bad bet in general, and American-led things. But I understand why people want to hedge their investments these days, and maybe have a bit more in cash. Which kind of cash, of course, then you get into currencies that gets complicated these days as well. So.
Diversification is what you preached, and that's the one piece I got out of that is
Yep.
One, don't bet against the States. Two, history doesn't necessarily repeat itself, but it rhymes. And three, diversify real assets, alternatives, some fixed income, some private debt, some alternative assets. That's how you build a real portfolio that wins and protects. So I like that. Good advice. Adam, you had a question?
Yeah, I do want to ask some questions about energy, but just quickly circling back to U.S. politics. Trump's in the media all the time, and Republicans are in the media. It seems kind of like he can do whatever he wants right now, and nobody's pushing back. Where are the Democrats in all this? Are they coming around on tariffs? Is there anything they can do and that they're not doing, or do they just not have the leadership right now?
The system they have a little different than ours because they don't have an official opposition leader, and so when they lose in their system, whoever the president is always has a dominant position. And of course, Trump is a master newsmaker. They call this attention economy. He is the most brilliant entrepreneur in the attention economy. If you aren't paying attention to him, just wait till tomorrow because there'll be a reason to. I don't know, for anybody who watched the Mark Carney piece, he actually preempted as Mark Carney saying, just so you know, there's the biggest announcement ever coming out early next week. I can't tell you what it is, but it's going to be huge, right? And Carney literally said, I'm sitting on the edge of my seat. He goes, not until next week, right? But think of him back to a reality show host. It's like, stay tuned next week for an extra special episode of, St. Elsewhere, right? It's really his nature, right, to do that. I do think that we'll see a general reforming of the opposition around in the United States. That just happens naturally over time. Obviously the easiest way to do that is when the other guy makes mistakes. So you'll see, and that happens even in a well-run government, and there'd be people who would argue whether the current administration is well run, but even in a well-run government, things come up, right? So there was an issue with a Signal chat. People have been following it, where a bunch of people were online talking about secret stuff and accidentally included a reporter. So these things make it easier for the opponents to question the competence of them. But I think as long as Donald Trump is president, he is going to be a dominant figure. It's going to be hard to imagine, A, because he's president, and B, because he's good at attention getting, he's going to dominate the media agenda one way or the other, right? Even when he wasn't president, we were watching him go to court. And I mean, even when he was the former president, he was still, 3 days out of 10, the story was about Donald Trump.
Yeah, for sure. Go ahead, Adam.
You touched on it before too, just about how we we're kind of captured with our oil stuff, having to ship it to the U.S. for refining capacity. I think one of the concerns about the Liberals in this election was how the energy industry has been regulated maybe over the last 10 years. And with the same, cabinet members sticking around right now, how do you think Carney will treat the Alberta and the energy industry, different than Trudeau did, or is it going to be more of the same?
I do think that if there's two or three big questions and I think no longer just the energy industry is concerned or investors concerned, that the Canadians are concerned about, that's one of them. And I think we are going to wait and see. The prime minister, when he was running to be prime minister, said the right things about not just renewables and the kind of things the previous government would have talked about, but also more traditional energy. And so I think that made people feel more comfortable. I think the cabinet is going to be very interesting to see. As I said, by the end of the week or early next week, we'll know who he's putting into key roles. I think we've had very strong signals from the Premier of Alberta and Saskatchewan before the election was over, saying these are the things that are important to us, and continued strong signals after, saying, just remind you, these were the things that were very important to us. And frankly, you've got alignment for the most part among premiers, even to the point where Premier Legault in Quebec, who would have never talked about pipelines in Quebec, has at least said that it's not that he'll never talk about them, which is progress. Mm-hmm. But you've certainly got Premier Ford and others who are big supporters of energy corridors and those sorts of ideas. So I think if I were, if we were sitting in the Prime Minister's office, they would know that this is one of the big issues they're going to get measured on. Now, that's the good news from my perspective, because I think we do need to very much track that energy independence and building, because this kind of infrastructure is going to take a long time to build. I think you could make the same discussion about critical minerals and mining and other resource extraction, which the Trudeau version of the Liberal government was not a particular friend of, although they got a little better near the end. So I think we'll be looking for the same things there. The flip side is there's an aspect of the coalition that elected Carney that were the same people who did have some of those concerns, right? So that part of the NDP vote that decided to vote for him this time, but might not vote for him next time, they've parked a vote there or given him their support, but they do continue to have some of the same concerns relative to climate and energy. So he's got to do a bit of a balance, but I am hopeful, I'll say at this stage, that we're going to see a different kind of government, but we're going to have to wait and see. And then, I mean, that's just the politicians getting out of the way. Government, even on a good day when it wants to do something, gets in its own way trying to do things. So for instance, his talk about getting rid of interprovincial trade barriers, that's something everybody's notionally wanted to do for the last 50 years. Just deciding you want to do it isn't the same as getting it done. So we're going to see how good this government is at getting things done. And one of the other critiques of the Trudeau government by some people was that even when they said they were going to do something, it sometimes took them a very long time to get it done. So I think we're looking for two things here, commitment on what they're going to do, but then the energy and the dedication to work through the problems to get it done.
It's great insight. So glad to have you on the podcast. Hey, let me ask you about, you touched on it earlier. I want to ask you two separate questions. One about the policy that they're going to take with respect to controlling interest rates. But first, I want to ask you, you touched on it earlier. You said you wouldn't bet against the U.S. We've had a lot of clients that have reached out to us over the past 3 months and said, Rob, I need to go to cash. I can't do this. I don't want to invest in the U.S. I want to stay away from that. I'm just going to wait till things sort themselves out, and then I'll get back into the market. So most of them, we were fortunate enough to talk them off. And in fact, a lot we convinced to add more money to their portfolio. But on the issue of whether or not you would avoid the U.S. or, invest just in Canada, or do you have a view on that?
Listen, I'm careful because I'm not an investment professional. That's you guys.
I still value your opinion.
Well, but having given you that little proviso, I think, the United States is a dynamic economy that has proven resilient over the last 100 years and has a number of flaws. But the great thing about the flaws, like we can talk about the debt level, we can talk about other things, we know about them. They're transparent. When you look at other options around the world, and people start to look at Asia and other places to place their money, but we know what the problems could be in the United States. I'm sure there's some we don't know about. A lot of other places in the world, because eventually you're going to invest your money somewhere, we don't really know what those problems are, right? So I would always rather be dealing with a place that has this kind of transparency, even if it, makes my tummy a little uncomfortable sometimes because I'm watching it bop around, because at least I can have awareness about it. So I think, obviously,
that's good. Yeah, that's a very good answer. So thank you for that. Hey, and now I'll jump to my question about interest rates. So we've had, I think we had like 7 or 8 consecutive rate cuts. Used to be a finance minister. Do you think they're handling this interest rate cycle properly? And what do you see in the future here?
So this scenario, I feel a little bit more comfortable in. Thank you. I know the expectation. Actually, I'm just watching Powell speak, so I don't even know as we record here what decision was made today. So I'm going to go out on a limb here, but I think they're going to be more concerned about inflation given the uncertainty relative to what's happening with the economy, and not rushing necessarily to bail out the administration with a rate with multiple rate cuts. That's the expectation is that there'll be rate cuts, and that's by economists over time. They're probably correct, but I think it's an interesting dynamic as between the Fed chair and between the administration. But right now, inflation. The Fed was criticized for not taking inflation seriously enough on the last cycle, and there is a tendency of all of us to fight the last war, right? So I think in general they're going to be looking at that. On the Canadian side, I have a more general comment, but I do think it's worth thinking about, again, as people think about Canada and the United States. The fact that Canadian rates are, I believe about a percent lower, right? Like on one hand, we understand we have a different economic environment, but I think one of the things we're going to see in the best outcome is that alignment between the Canadian and the U.S. economy, whether that's on tax rates, interest rates, or other things, is going to come closer together. It's deviated. Things like environmental regulation and otherwise, it's become just different in Canada than it has in the US. I would argue to a level that's probably hard to sustain. And I think a guy like Mark Carney is the exact kind of guy who would understand that. You can't be sitting beside your biggest customer, as you made the point yesterday to the president, and the biggest economy in the world, and have a wildly different set of policies. So I think in terms of Canadian rates, again, there'll be a lot of factors affecting it, but letting that gap grow too much, I think, becomes a bit of a challenge. Because, quite frankly, you've got to sell 10-year Canadian bonds. And why would
who's buying a 10-year Canadian a point lower than the 10-year US?
And the reality is lots of people right now, thankfully, because we can finance our government. But at some point, you got to say it's the most liquid instrument in the world versus the Canadian 10-year. And I would argue on things like tax rates, on things we now don't have a carbon tax, so but that was an example of an industrial input that was costing Canadian. Like, how much more weight can you put on Canadian business and Canadian taxpayers before the obvious choice of U.S. options?
How is the spread relative to what it's been historically? This is probably at the larger end of the spread between Canada and US.
If you factor out the last sort of, I'll call it 3 or 4 weeks, where there was some real interesting swings because of just instability in the 10-year that we hadn't seen relative to the tariff announcement. It has, generally speaking, I think, I'll call it the last 5 years, but really you could go back to the last 10 years. There's been a divergence between tax rates, interest rate, two economies that have been pretty fundamentally linked, but right. A belief that we can, for example, have a tax on carbon that a competitor literally across the border doesn't have, right? And that just makes it tougher on our side of the border. It used to be
perfectly correlated, and now we're like at a 0.7 or a 0.6 or whatever it may be. And I can tell you that they held the rate steady today.
Oh, did they? Yeah. Well, I'm glad, because I would have looked silly otherwise. So, but that would have, but that would have been should have done that an hour ago. Damn. But they're it just and now of course Powell was appointed by Trump. His term is up next year. There are certain pressure points. I think we made the point earlier, Adam. What can't Trump do? There seem to be some things that get his attention, right? And things like when he was talking about firing the Fed chair, that seemed to make people uncomfortable, so he stopped.
Just getting back to rates a little bit, I think you're right that most economists are predicting rate cuts, and they have been for quite some time. But the Fed had held steady today, and I've been sitting at my desk over the last couple of weeks watching the yields on the 10-year tick up a little bit, which is kind of surprising. Do you think that these tariffs are going to lead to inflation, like sustainable inflation, or just kind of a one-off rise in prices and then back to normal?
Listen, the consensus of economists is that for sure it's inflationary. In fact, I think even the only question is the one you asked: is it sustained, or is it a bump? You can make good arguments for both. I think the bigger risk is just the general instability, which causes people to need to protect. The idea of both inflation, and now the shortages, they're going to follow, which will create more inflation because there'll be fewer products, and whether it's a big job with something the size of the U.S. consumer economy to reconfigure their demand habits, right? Say like, and the president sort of famously this week said, well, instead of having $30, people will have $2. Well, it's not an unreasonable point, right? That this is an economy that has consumed a whole lot of cheap goods, and maybe people should buy less of higher quality made somewhere else. But we're talking about consumer behavior, which is by no means a straight line. So it feels like inflation would be, it would be hard not to expect it. And I think the decision today by Powell suggests that's his bigger concern, right? That's
It's a bit strange
because it would have been
hearing,
easier to cut rates and make the market happy, right?
yeah, it's a bit strange hearing an American politician talk about not consuming things, right? Like it's sort of un-American in a way.
But what is the strange thing about Donald Trump is there's some truth. Like if we think about it, there is an interesting truth behind some of what he's been saying about the choices consumers have made in the U.S. and Americans have made, and what that's meant to other Americans who used to make dolls, right? And what's the right answer, right? But back to what one thinks and what one can actually do. Like it's interesting to see it and talk about it, but it's another thing to actually be able to execute a change like that. And Americans haven't been, well, we know in the last administration when prices went up, that's when they got grumpy, right? Now, arguably there were other things about the previous president that made them unhappy, but going to the cash register and milk costing more and is a problem. Now, right now, the other thing that the other side would point out on this is that gas is quite inexpensive in the U.S. Prices, again, when in which will happen again if demand is coming down and there's considerations about a recession and other things that tends to drive those prices down. So there's going to be ups and downs, and how that affects the actual consumer. America's a big place. There is no a consumer. There's close to 400 million of them, I think everybody's going to be watching those measures we have of consumer sentiment much more closely than they normally do.
I'll go to some couple rapid fire questions. That's all right.
Ooh, rapid fire. Okay.
Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So this has to be quick.
Short answer.
So you have-
Got it. Yeah.
yeah.
Keep the answer short.
Most underrated finance minister in Canadian history?
Still Paul Martin.
Biggest political myth about how budgets are made?
That we know what's going to happen in the future.
Okay. First thing you read every morning?
Financial Times.
First app you open every morning?
Bloomberg.
And economic indicator most overrated?
Anything that's rear looking right now. And I want to expand, if I can expand on that briefly, because it'll be useful here. One of the things that surprised me in the role as finance minister, you do have access to reams of data, right? But almost all of it is rear view mirror stuff, just the reality of it, right? So when you get into a turbulent time, especially an unprecedented turbulent time, and you mentioned COVID, which was one of the times when I was actually in the job at finance minister, the ability to judge future based on a different past is actually dangerous. And I think that's one of the challenges, that the current governments will be facing, federal and provincial, is these are unprecedented times, and all the data in all the history might be great, but it may not have a lot to do with what's happening in the future.
Worst piece of financial advice you hear way too often?
Sell, right?
Yes, sell that. If you had to pick one sector to watch, keep an eye on over the next 12 months.
Over the next 12 months, I am really a believer in what's going to happen around the whole energy transition. And I think, and I think it's not as simple as going traditional. Yeah.
Energy, got it.
Yeah.
Favorite book on economics or politics?
Oh, favorite book on politics. I think probably I was a big fan of Barack Obama's biography.
Okay, yeah. Bay Street or Queen's Park? What's more cutthroat?
Depends on the day.
Last question of the rapid fire, then I'll go to Adam. If you weren't doing this, what would you be doing?
I think if I wasn't doing this, I would probably be running a business, which is what I did most of my business life. I was a CEO, but it's kind of nice not to have that responsibility right now.
Yeah, no kidding. That's it for my rapid fire. That was great.
All right.
Let's say you're back in the finance seat for 6 months. You're Minister of Finance. What's the first policy you'd rush through today?
I would be looking at tax rates for individuals.
Lower them.
Lower them.
I'm glad you didn't say raise them. Who impressed you the most behind closed door in politics that most of us wouldn't know?
People might expect me to say this, but Doug Ford has a great connection to people And one of the things you can get very removed from when you get into those more lofty positions is people. And he works very hard every day to keep that connection. And that is, over time, what's made him resilient.
How do you view, now that you're on this side, the relationship between like the government and the markets, and what impact should they have?
I think people who are investing and people who are active in the markets don't spend enough time trying to understand what government is saying. Government actually is very easy to understand. It does say what it's going to do, and I'm a little bit, this isn't my preference, because as a person who believes that less government would be better, I've been disappointed by the fact that government has grown to be as involved as it is in everybody's lives, but government's involved in everybody's lives and in many people's businesses. And paying attention to government will tell you a lot. And a lot of people just choose not to pay attention. And then they're surprised when government does something it said it was going to do 6 months ago.
Interesting.
What's your take on the housing market in Toronto and Ontario as a former finance minister of the province?
I mean, we're in for a reset here. The number of housing starts has dropped dramatically and would be expected to for a number of systemic reasons, not the least of which was interest rates going up, but the incredible increase in demand, but not being offset by supply. It is something that, back to what governments say they're going to do, and this is a good example. You have municipal leadership in Ontario, provincial leadership, and federal leadership all saying that, you know, the most important issue for people is the cost of housing. That probably means, you know, they're going to not go through it in a straight line, but they're going to try and find a way to fix it. But this is something that takes time, because, you know, if there aren't housing starts this year, then there aren't houses 2 years from now. So there needs the delay on that is going to put short-term pressure on everything from rents to housing prices as demand contracts.
Any
Are
signs
you
that the condo
ahead, Adam.
market is improving at all? I've heard a lot of talk about the glut in the condo market.
I mean, I haven't looked at it recently, but again, there are fewer and fewer new condos coming onto the market. That will right itself in terms of a supply, demand imbalance over time. But some of the basic fundamentals around where the financing was coming for those units is going to come down to a certain segment of that is about individual investors who were buying 1, 2, 3, 4 condos and their ability to do that. And then institutions as well being willing to finance it. So that model isn't working the way it used to, and I think that's going to slow things down. That said, population, there's still an increasing population, and that population is going to need housing. So, you know, mid to long term, it sorts itself out. But I think in the short term, we're going to see fewer cranes. Well, we are seeing fewer cranes. You know.
What do you think about Canadian debt load overall, the consumer debt load?
Consumer debt load is a bit of a concern. I'm more, I've been conscious of the public sector debt load as nobody can be any more creditworthy than the sovereign that they live in, right? Whether you're a company or an individual, you're only as solvent as the country you live in. There are different ways of measuring the relative debt load of both the provinces. I mean, Ontario, on the numbers, is the biggest sub-sovereign debtor in the world. That's not new. It's been that way for some time. It has some economic fundamentals that on a measurement basis make it okay. But it is also all of the provinces, although they're not explicitly guaranteed by the federal government, they're implicitly guaranteed by the federal government, and the federal government balance sheet doesn't look as good as it did 10 years ago. So I've thought more about that than the consumer space. But in the consumer space, I think one of the reasons why, a reason for interest rates to not go higher here from a public policy point of view is the number of mortgages that are coming due for refinancing. Right, and there's a significant segment of mortgages that are going to be coming through in the next couple of years, and we're literally talking about adding hundreds, if not $1,000 of cost to some people as those mortgages refinance. So there's a real incentive, subject to all those macro influences we talked about, and the divergence from the U.S. I mean, that might be the biggest impact if we were to run into a bout of inflation that was serious, and the Bank of Canada had to respond with increasing interest rates. That would magnify the impact on, literally the millions of Canadians that are going to renew their mortgages over the next couple of years.
What's your take on the Canadian dollar it's held up pretty well since tariffs have started, contrary to what most of the opinions that I heard before the election.
Yeah, listen, I think it's always, if we just go to the basics of currency, it's a underlying measure of the relative value of the sovereign, right? That it represents, and we are potentially in a period where you could have a lot of flux in that, and we've seen some of that volatility, right? And so, I think it is going to always be a little bit sketchy as we go through a major renegotiation of this trade relationship. It's currency is probably the hardest thing to know, because the number of variables are so wide, right? But it's it is going to be a function finally of the relative power of our economy versus our major trading partner and the other people we trade with, and that's going to be the United States for now. If people don't buy Canadian things, they don't need Canadian dollars. So
yeah, and I think people are committed to buying Canadian things right now. Like it's crazy what we're seeing, right? The consumer behavior is actually changing, and
that's an interesting, and I don't know the answer to this. How long term or short term will that be? You talked about some of the clients, I think, who I think, and a number of people who are making. I've know folks who are selling homes in the U.S. and really making like long-term choices about where they want to be and where they want to spend their money, as relates to the economy and the dollar. To the extent that people aren't buying, if we're not selling our oil, if we're not selling our potash, if we're not selling our movies to people in other countries, then they don't need Canadian dollars. To if world economy slows down, then demand for the dollar could slow down too. Right. And back to that rearview mirror view of things, it isn't going to be very helpful. Historic currency fluctuations aren't going to be a great measure if there's a major change of the dynamic around things that affect currency.
Yeah, that's when you break out your purchasing power parity equation.
Yeah, we'll get back to the gold conversation. Yeah,
exactly. All right. Well, I do want to respect your time, and I'm very thankful that you came out to Rod. I want to thank you for joining me today. It's not every day we get to talk to someone who's been in the room, who's seen all the big decisions made, and how it helps interpret the landscape for investors. I really appreciate your insight, the fiscal policy, what it means for Canadians. Great to have you here today. Don't forget, guys, subscribe, share this episode with a friend. Politics, markets, whatever they like, send them this episode. And don't forget to give us a review. Put your comments below. We'd love to hear from you. And if you'd like to book your no obligation consultation to chat about how this can impact your portfolio, your investment portfolio, because that's what we're talking about here. We are portfolio managers. We're good at what we do. Go to speaktorob.com. We'd love to book a no obligation consultation. We will figure it out, I promise. And you get to talk to me and Adam. We'll try to get Rod on there, but he's pretty busy. Probably won't get him. But
next time in Winnipeg, can't wait to see you guys. So look forward to that. Go Jets,
go Jets, go.
Go Jets, go.
All right,
go Leafs, go too. Come on, we need all the help we can get.
Go. Yeah. You know what? I used to be anti-Leafs, but I want you guys to win. Like maybe not the finals if we play against Winnipeg, but like just to win another series would be fantastic for you guys.
Yeah, go Canada, go.
Let's go. All right, thanks guys. We'll see you in the next episode.